Welcome to the Boston Art Podcast,
Boston's premier art podcast,
where we talk art, culture, and philosophy.
My name is Theodore Earthworms.
And I am Brian Huntress.
Welcome to the show. Hey guys, Theo here to provide some quick context to the upcoming episode. What you're about to listen to is the 6th segment in a 7-part interview series we recorded this fall about an exhibition that is currently on view at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. This exhibition is titled Touching Roots, Black Ancestral Legacies in the Americas, and it's on the 3rd floor of the Art of the Americas wing in the MFA. It's included in general admission, so there's no extra cost to see it, and we highly recommend you check it out. This week's installment is with Touching Roots curator and professor of African American Studies at Emory University, Kyrah Malika Daniels. Kyrah's research interest is on comparative religion, art history, material culture, and ritual healing traditions in the Black Atlantic, with focus on sacred arts and ritual healing practices among Haitian and Congolese communities. We had a really interesting conversation, and we're really happy to present it to you now. We were able to talk to 7 of the curators and artists involved in Touching Roots, and we've learned so much and had so much fun doing so. We're releasing these interviews in chronological order so you can learn with us. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the show.
Great. So we're obviously super excited to talk to you, and we've talked to a large group of people so far involved in the Touching Roots show, including artists and curators. So this has been a super educational and illuminating experience for us. So we'd love to talk about, your career, the things you do, and your role in the show. I guess maybe we could start off talking about who you are and what you do. It's probably a really big and broad question.
It's not a concern. Well, thank you all so much for having me. And my name is Kyrah Malika Daniels. I'm one of those folks who love to use my full 3 names. I am starting a new position at Emory University. Previously, I was working at Boston College as an assistant professor of art history, Africana studies, and theology. So those I really consider to be my 3 homes, if you will. More Black studies, religion, and art history than theology per se. I am starting a new position at Emory in African American studies, and I teach African and African diaspora art history and religious traditions. I am especially interested in Central Africa and the Caribbean, and my own research focuses on healing traditions and art forms from Haiti and the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm currently finishing up a book manuscript for my first book, which is entitled Art of the Healing Gods, Illness, Imbalance, and Ritual Arts in the Black Atlantic. And my interest really focuses on thinking about how different implements are used in traditional healing ceremonies in Haiti and the Democratic Republic of Congo that have these aesthetic qualities that are at times quite arresting. I think that there's been some really fantastic studies on the use of medicinal plants and leaves in healing traditions. And then there have been some very interesting art history studies on the arts, for instance, of initiation or mortuary arts. But there have been fewer studies that connect those different fields of healing traditions, art history, and religion, thinking about what are the implements that are used to heal people. So I look at, for instance, ritual rattles, sacred bundles, divination mirrors, and mystic pots, which are all used, as healers explain, as a way to call in ancestors and diagnose a problem, diagnose a condition that somebody may be facing, and heal somebody in a holistic fashion. So in terms of my own contributions to the exhibition, I was very graciously invited by Martina Tenga and the team at the MFA to join a series of conversations regarding the importance and the role of Black arts in a very broad and global context. And my interest is very comparative in my training, and so I was very interested in thinking about how the show reaches very transnationally across regions. And I have, because of my interest specifically in religion, I was especially interested in the pieces that allude to or make reference to traditions of the ancestors, traditions from, African heritage, and also very interested in pieces in the United States that are making reference to African art forms, because they find this a powerful way to connect with heritage.
Wow, that's incredible. There's a lot to think about there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on your new position and on the book. Those are both really exciting changes.
Thank you so much. I'll be even more excited when I'm signing that contract, but
yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
Wow, that's great.
I'm curious to know what brought you to wanting to study religious art, or I don't know if you would say religious or spiritual and healing artifacts in the first place.
That's a great question, and I think religious art is a great term.
Oh, okay.
I would say that I grew up in a house filled with art, and I found it really inspiring. My mother is Haitian, my father is African American, and both of them are, I would say, like lay art collectors. When I use that term, I mean it lovingly, because it doesn't mean that they would necessarily go to auctions, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they would spend a lot of money. But every time we would travel somewhere, and often when I would travel to, my mother's home country of Haiti, we would spend a lot of time in the marketplace and a lot of time looking at paintings, a lot of times collecting objects and artifacts that proved unique or that caught their attention, that caught their eye. And my parents can buy art for each other. So it's something that I saw, as like a beautiful tradition of theirs of expressing love, and really finding a shared language, if you will. Always having an eye for a particular color palette that they know somebody else would like. Finding works that we knew were within a lineage of art traditions that we were familiar with, but that did something different. To give you some examples, Haitian art I find especially compelling because there's such incredible variety. I often say that, like, in the Caribbean, we are known for many expressive art traditions and cultures, but whereas Jamaica perhaps is so well known for its musical arts. You can think about reggae, and you can think about dancehall music as being these incredibly global traditions of arts, but sonic arts. In Haiti, visual arts is our medium, and multimedia arts is our medium. And so, there's a lot of traditions, for instance, of painted canvas and things from the past 60 to 70 years or so. But now people have started to paint calabashes. People have started to paint leather works. People have started to paint woodworks. People have started to paint dried cassava leaves and dried banana leaves, right? And so we, I think, have a very interesting relationship to our environment by seeing everything as potentially, something that can be transformed into a form of artistic expression. So how did I grow up? I grew up in a fashion that was surrounded by art. And when I took my first African art history class, that my mind was really blown, because I thought, wow, all of these works that I thought, were just meant to be hung on the wall have a lineage, have a tradition. And in many West African and Central African cultural contexts, so many art expressions are used in a religious context or ceremony, whether that's in the context of initiation or for birthing rites or for healing traditions, or masks that are danced in. They have often a sort of ceremonial life of their own. And that I found captivating to no end, finding out this intersection, if you will, of religion and the arts. I had been long interested in religion as well. When I was younger, I wanted to be an Egyptologist. I wanted to climb in pyramids, and I was like, oh, this is the coolest thing. And so I really consider myself to basically be doing that sort of work of allowing objects to tell stories and being interested in how objects and art forms tell stories, just in a different regional context than Egypt.
Yeah. Wow. So is there something that you'd be able to share with us about... Oh, sorry. I'm a little far away from the mic. I was going to say, is there something that you'd be able to share with us about your experience in the show, as far as how you found meaning in the work that you were doing there, or what it was like for you?
Absolutely. I think I'll answer the question in a few different ways. The first thing that I would say is I love collaborative projects. I feel like it's such an opportunity to learn from others. And I really loved how intentional the curatorial team was in creating an intergenerational advisor collective. So we had people who were ranging between, their 20s and their 70s with a range of different experiences in terms of having formally studied art history, being an artist themselves, being scholars of religion. And that, I think, created for a really exciting set of conversations. And the curatorial team at the MFA, I think, was very interested in telling a story that was local to Boston, but that still had global reach, and that had, a broader reach beyond the limits of Boston or Massachusetts or New England even. And I really appreciated the opportunity to learn from people like Stephen Hamilton, to learn from people like Napoleon Henderson, to learn from people like Shanoa Baker, and conversation with them. So that's one thing that I really appreciated about the process itself. The second thing that I would say is that it was a real delight to think both small scale and large scale. As somebody who hasn't necessarily curated my own show, but who has served on a advisor or curatorial level, I've had a chance to see different scopes of exhibitions come to life. And one thing that I think I really can appreciate more now is the attention to detail. What does it mean to create, a rectangular space where you want viewers, you want participants to walk through the space in a particular fashion, right? It means that you need to build certain walls in certain areas to guide them forward. Or alternatively, if you want them to explore things on their own, what does it mean to create a more open space? So that, to me, is a more minute level of detail that was really interesting in thinking about, is this a chronological story we're telling? And everybody agreed no. We want there to be a good representation of different time periods represented from the early 1900s to the later 20th century. But we didn't feel like the story could only be told in a chronological fashion. Instead, certain themes were highlighted. And so I thought that sort of minute attention to detail in terms of where we're positioning certain objects was really interesting. And then on a larger scale, thinking about, what do we want the takeaway to be? What do we want participants to remember about this type of exhibition? And I think that we all agreed that we wanted to reach a very wide audience who was interested in hearing a story, again, that was both local, having and featuring a number of different Boston artists, names whom they might recognize from newspapers or I'm thinking of Mylou Jones, for instance, again, Stephen Hamilton, Ife Franklin, both of whom are, fantastic local artists who are producing multimedia works now. And what it means to be introduced to artists that maybe they've never heard of before because they're not necessarily always considered part of the African diaspora. Like we had a few Dominican artists included. We had a few Brazilian artists included. And I think that was really important because Brazil is not always put on the map when thinking about African heritage. It should be, because it has the largest population of Black people in the Americas, but it's not. And the Dominican Republic is also not always put on the map when talking about African heritage. And I think that was something we were really committed to in terms of what do we want to take away to be? That, Blackness extends beyond Africa and extends beyond the United States. It has all of these, beautiful tendrils, if you will, extending into different regions of the Americas, Africa, Europe. And these artists, it's not a new thing. Oh, that's like, one of my least favorite things to hear is when people say or suggest that cosmopolitanism or globalization is a new phenomenon, right? And I think it's true that the internet has created a very exciting set of ways that we can be in communication with one another. But globalization is ancient. It's old, and when you're talking about the history of the slave trade beginning in the 1500s, that's globalization, right? And so this isn't a new phenomenon, but it's happening in a different way now.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about too. I liked what you were saying about the show having such like global roots but also an emphasis on local, because we've had the pleasure of talking to some of the local artists that are involved in the show, the contemporary ones, and it's been so wonderful speaking with them. Like she spoke with Ife Franklin, Stephen Hamilton. I think that's it so far as visual artists, but it's been a pleasure. So it's been interesting seeing the Boston community come forward in the show.
I also
Absolutely.
I have one question too. Do you find, or like, I guess in thinking about museums, do you think that it's a challenge for them to be representing, art and culture and history and things of that nature, but do you think it's a challenge to represent that, balancing that with representing local people? Because I find that, I mean, even if like, what am I trying to say here? Like, because it does seem uniquely difficult to be trying to include all this old historical stuff and this, non chronological story, and it is a beautiful thing to be including new artists in that. But I'm kind of wondering if you find that to be, I'm asking the most like convoluted question ever right now. I'm sorry, but like, I guess like it. What am I trying to say? Do you see a question in here, Theo?
Like reaching into the past and also correctly advocating for the present, maybe?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess was it a challenge to do that, to find a way to include multiple time periods?
I think it was a challenge that we embraced, and I'm grateful because it was something that, they're, I think, taking new steps towards doing in the museum with the creation of these new types of galleries. And what I mean by that is, traditionally in a lot of art museums, stories are told regionally and or chronologically, so you'll have like the ancient past, or ancient Greece and Rome, and you'll have Africa, which of course is not one country, but
Right.
unfortunately is often referred to as one country. And then you'll have art of the Americas, which actually is unique to the MFA rather than just art of the United States or something like this. But so stories are often told in such a fashion as to guide a viewer through time periods of ancient yore, and bringing you, maybe to a slightly more relatable historical period. But contemporary is contemporary and modern is modern, right? And those shows tend to be separated. And I think what's exciting about what the MFA is doing with Touching Roots is trying to take a slightly different approach. Yes, all the work is more contemporary. It's coming from the modern period or the contemporary period. But I also think they're trying to encourage new ways of storytelling by focusing on these different themes and themes that you don't always see in the context of a museum. So, for instance, we had a theme focused on ancestral traditions. We had a theme focused on Pan-Africanism, right? And so how does a story about political thought, philosophy, and, very clear activism and advocacy for Black rights align with the arts movement? I think that's something that not a lot of museums and not a lot of exhibitions have focused on. The fact that a lot of artists, particularly in the 1960s, 1970s, and moving forward, have been very invested in liberation for Black people, have been very invested in civil rights and invested in different ways to imagine what liberation can look like. And that liberation is not simply about voters' rights, though that's a critical component of Black experience. Liberation is not simply about better access to healthcare. It's not simply about better schools, though all of these things are essential. It's also about what does it mean to be able to express yourself comfortably, by wearing your hair in a natural fashion? What does it mean to express yourself, comfortably by belonging to a religious tradition that has been demonized by European civilization for 500 years, right? And so I think the ways that Martina Tenga and the rest of the curatorial team were envisioning this exhibition as an opportunity to tell a different story about Black politics, Black art, Black culture, and civilizations is really an exciting one, because, again, there are opportunities for African Americans in the United States to see linkages that maybe they didn't know existed in places like Haiti, in places like Ghana, in places like Brazil, in places like the Dominican Republic. And I think that's a story that deserves to be told more often.
Do you feel like there is a kind of missing link or lack of storytelling and highlighting of Black artists from the 20th century, specifically like artists that may have been born in like the 30s or 40s.
Can you repeat the question? Do I feel like those artists have been well represented?
Well, I guess I say that because I feel like it's a very popular type of exhibit for a museum to have, where they might be expressionist artists during the World War II era, or artists that were working in the 50s and 60s during modernism. But it's often, or as far as my limited experience goes, seems to be mostly white artists.
Yes, I would agree with that. I would add to that as well that I think there's a way in which stories about Black artists often tend to be exceptional. Meaning, we have this exceptional Romare Bearden artist, right? An incredible, visual artist, multimedia artist, someone who works with collage. You might see several examples of Romare Bearden shows, or several examples where, if they're going to mention a Black artist who plays a prominent role in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, it's somebody like Romare Bearden. But Romare Bearden, anyway, he's not necessarily somebody represented in the show, but I give him as an example. I think that those stories are typically told from a much more nationalist perspective in the United States. And they are not often connected to, what are art movements looking like in Ghana during this time period? Or even, I think one of the most exciting things is, how are African Americans, and I use that term very intentionally, how are Black Americans, people of African descent in the United States, envisioning Africa? Right? That is something that really deserves to be explored further, and that I think the show does wonderfully, because there are ways in which you see, such a serious set of researchers and artists doing work about what contemporary life in Ghana is like, or what contemporary life in Haiti is like. Maïlou Jones, for instance, spent time in Haiti, and there are some of her works that really demonstrate an understanding of the role of religion in artistic practice, but also what are ways that they're imagining, a sort of theoretical Africa, Africa as icon, Africa as symbol, right? And so I think that's something unique. Placing African American artists, first of all, in conversation with other Black artists, as if they've always been in conversation, because they have been in conversation for a long time. And also thinking less in a limited fashion about the chronology component of how to tell this story, rather than thinking about how some of these broader themes can be woven together in a different type of tapestry for an exhibition.
Which is, it's an important structure too, because now that you're saying that, I'm thinking about the way that we see these gallery shows typically represented in the museum. And like when we represent art from the Americas, we often reference roots in Europe or like France.
That's right.
Like, it's not an unusual way to approach it, but in this context,
Absolutely.
It really is.
That's right. That's right.
Could you talk a little bit more too, just where this is your area of expertise, about the how do I phrase this? The religious impact. You said the religious process of art making. Was that a phrase you just used? Could you talk about that a little bit too, and how that came forward in your discussions with the curatorial team?
Sure. I'll give the example of Maïlou Jones. That's one of the pieces that comes to mind. And then I'll move to some more contemporary artists like Ife Franklin and Stephen Hamilton. So with Maïlou Jones, for instance, she traveled to Haiti, and she was very interested in thinking more globally about Black experiences in the Americas. And she has a piece in the show, and forgive me, I can't think of the name right now, but I'm sure you'll be able to find it. She has a piece in the show with that is called Vévé, actually. It's called Vévé, and Vévé Vaudou. And it was really important to me to sit and dialogue with my collaborators and with the curatorial team about this piece, because when it was acquired, there was a misspelling of Vodou. So the correct spelling of the Haitian religion is Vodou. And the tradition that probably most people are familiar with, or that they've heard of, or that they've seen written, is voodoo. Voodoo, right? And it was really important to me that we get the spelling right, not only because she was trying to represent Haiti, Haitian culture, and Haitian religious traditions, and I'll get into the details of that more specifically in a moment, but because she spelled it right in her painting.
Oh.
Okay, so she spelled it correctly, but whomever cataloged it at the time immediately went to their first association with the demonized representation, and I really should say the misrepresentation of this Haitian religion, which is voodoo. Right? And I'm not blaming anyone, I'm not faulting anybody, but these are the types of things that can happen when an artist perhaps is, more well-versed or more familiar with a particular cultural context than a member of a curatorial team, and when we aren't aware of our biases. That's what I want to highlight, right? When we aren't aware of our biases. So she did this piece, we talked about it, and it was such a rich conversation. So the word VV is a fon or fongbe term, F-O-N, from ancient Dahomey, which is current day Benin. And the tradition is a graphic writing system of Africa. It is a tradition in which certain symbols are drawn out on the earthen floor. Typically, or historically, this would have been with a type of natural chalk or kaolin clay. In the context of the Haitian diaspora, and the context of, I should say, the African diaspora in Haiti, VV is still a sacred symbol that is used to invoke spiritual and divine entities. And for every different spirit in the pantheon of Haitian Vodou, there is a different sacred symbol associated with that spirit. It's their signature calling card, if you will. And these sacred symbols, known as VV, are traced in either cornmeal or flour. And that is intentional. They're not permanent. They're not made to be long lasting. They are done at the beginning of ceremony to open the space and to create a portal, to create a welcome and an invitation to spirits to join ceremony, to come visit ceremony, to offer blessings, guidance, counsel, advice, and then they are danced over in ceremony. And it is as the portals are opened, the portals are eventually closed by this dancing over and effacement of these sacred portals done in cornmeal and flour. And she did enough research to, recreate a VV of Ogu, who is a spirit of war, a spirit of diplomacy, and who has roots in West Africa, as well as a new manifestation in the Americas. This is a spirit that's recognized still today in Cuba, in Haiti, and in Brazil. So very global reach, very global dimensions. And so you have here, just to trace these different regions represented, an African-American artist who is interested in recreating a Haitian sacred art form which draws inspiration from a West African sacred art form. That's at least 3 regions represented and 2 levels of reinterpretation, at least. The fact that the rendering originally of VV would be on the earthen floor in cornmeal and flour or in kaolin clay and chalk is now reinterpreted through a new medium, through a medium of painting, right? And so there's these multiple levels of interpretation that are occurring, but it doesn't make the art form less recognizable. It's just taking on a new manifestation, right? So that's, I think, one example of a really exciting way that you're seeing a sacred art tradition, in a new light, in a new context. And I think Stephen Hamilton and Ife Franklin are 2 absolutely stellar and incredibly gifted and skilled artists of today who are drawing from West African traditions and reinterpreting them in a beautiful and respectful and innovative, fresh fashion. So Stephen Hamilton is trained as a visual artist who works with, fine arts, as they would quote unquote call them, meaning painting, drawing. He's also trained not only in the Western canon, but also in West Africa with traditional Yoruba weavers of Nigeria and traditional wood carvers and traditional metal workers. And so he incorporates these multimedia artistic expressions traditions into his contemporary works, drawing from ancient cultures and also bringing new life and new interpretation. Ife Franklin is drawing from indigo dye traditions, which are a major importance in West Africa and have incredible significance. Indigo is one of the most significant cash crops of the United States, and she's very much drawing from the knowledge that Africans were enslaved. There's this misconception that Africans were randomly enslaved and randomly taken, by force or through negotiations of trade. But that's not true. Many Africans were enslaved because of their skill sets. And so you had enslaved peoples taken from regions of Senegambia because of their knowledge of rice cultivation that was then used and employed in rice cultivation in the U.S. South. Right? You had enslaved Africans who were taken from regions such as Mali, such as Nigeria, because of their knowledge of indigo production, which was used to make jeans eventually in the United States. Indigo was what was originally used as the blue dye, the quintessential blue dye. And so I think getting a chance to see their work side by side, the work of artists, who were trained 50 years ago or, 100 years ago even. Another amazing tradition is Gullah Geechee basket weaving. And there's a Gullah Geechee basket that's featured in the show. This is coming directly from Congo traditions and coming from Central Africa. There are clear roots in exploring the history of basket weaving, but it's not something that is only found in Africa, right? There's also a tradition of sweetgrass braiding in Native American traditions of the U.S. South, First Nations communities of the U.S. South, right? And so what are the ways that African Americans are drawing from these different lineages of their heritage and different lineages of indigenous people in Africa as well as indigenous peoples in the Americas to create a new form? I think that is something that the show really did quite magnificently.
Yeah, that's really incredible to think about too. The amount of work in the show. We spoke with Martina in the gallery for about an hour and a half or so, and we saw it was lovely. It was really enlightening. But we saw a range of work, some of which were from contemporary artists and some of which were from artists that have now passed. But we didn't even get into everything, and there was so much to see and so many different places represented.
I'm curious too, in discussing, like you mentioned that Stephen Hamilton being trained in the Western canon and with these aesthetic traditions in West Africa, which is so cool. We got to talk with Stephen too, and that was a wonderful conversation.
Oh, he's amazing. He's such a dear friend and colleague. He's so brilliant.
Oh, that's so cool. It's crazy to imagine you two in conversation, because like something that's been so fun and like wild about this whole experience of being able to interview all of you guys is I've been joking behind the scenes that these interviews are completely like wasted on me, because I feel like I'm probably asking the stupidest questions, because I'm like, wow, this is anyway.
Well, what I'll say to that, Brian, is that we're all educators, and I think that that's something that we're all really passionate about. So I don't believe that there are no stupid questions. I think they exist. Okay. But I think it's very hard. I think it's very hard to ask stupid questions about art because, each question unlocks a door. Mm-hmm. And there are always ways to think differently about, something that you feel very conversant about. So, that's something I'll add.
Right. And one thing I wanted to like, I don't know if this is maybe this is kind of an obvious observation or maybe this isn't true, but it's kind of funny how in a lot of the Western canon and when talking about American art, people often refer back to like this colonial kind of painting, like portraits and pictures of generals from England or whatever. And I think one thing that I've been thinking about recently, because talking about weaving and fabric dyeing and all of these different West African, techniques. And it's kind of, I just think it's interesting to point out that the Western canon seems to be, or do you think that it's built on top of that? Because canvas has to be weaved and cotton has to be grown, and like all of these utensils and dyes and things that the Western, I guess I actually have no idea if I'm right or not. Like, is that true? Like, do you feel like a lot of American art was built on top of the stolen labor
yes,
of enslaved
absolutely.
people?
Yes, because I think that the American Empire was built on top of the labor of enslaved
Right.
African peoples, as many of the empires of the Western world were. And I think that you're bringing up an excellent point about materials. Stephen is another person who's really deeply knowledgeable about this. But, you know, the search for pigments is, in and of itself, such a fascinating history. I mean, we can think about many different reasons for Europeans traveling the world, exploring the world. But we know that one of the stories that we hear is that Europeans were in search of spices. That's wild. To think about the fact that so much of the colonial history we're familiar with is actually based off of the fact that Europeans were curious about color palettes and spices that would enrich what cultural traditions they already had. I mean, the search for the deepest blues, you know, led to a really interesting obsession and fixation with indigo. That's one example. Cobalt as well. Cobalt and lapis lazuli were extremely important in the production of these, you know, rich, profound, deep blues. And the search for these types of colors in not only artistic production for things like paintings, but also for clothing and for fabric, for textiles, is a big part of colonial history, for sure. And I think that that's, you know, even thinking about what the Western canon is, I think needs to be expanded, right? Because when you're talking about African peoples living in the Americas, don't they then become part of the West?
Right.
Right? What does it mean when we start considering and including and incorporating Indigenous First Nations peoples as, you know, members, you know, involuntary members of a Western canon, in the sense of they are the original inhabitants of the West? Right. And you know, I don't want to go too far by saying like we should consider all artists who live in the Americas as Western per se. But even that concept, right, of a Western canon is founded upon the idea that there wasn't a canon established in the Western world until people of European descent arrived. And that, I think, is very limiting.
And that's also, that concept is partially something this show leans into also, with examining Africa from an African American perspective and kind of tracing those lineages, I guess.
Those roots.
Yeah, those roots.
Those roots, well said. Yeah, I would agree with that very much so.
Yeah, it is really incredible too. Like, I don't know, even like something to think about too. Like, I don't know if these were made from indigo, but blue is like an extremely colonial color. Like, you see that in so much, not just colonial art, but even in the things they were wearing.
Yes.
You know, like, I wonder if that was made. I mean, well, everything back then was probably made, you know, through slavery, but.
Yes, that's true. And I also think that, I mean, that's one example that's a little bit easier to point to. But when you mentioned cotton, I mean, that's literally the, you know, tagline for Hanes underwear was the fabric of our lives, right? Cotton, the fabric of our lives. That wasn't true all over the world, but that was certainly true in the Western world. And how was that cotton produced? How is it, you know, cultivated, harvested, and then refined to be made into textiles with the history of enslaved African peoples, you know? And there were different crops in different parts of the Americas, you know? We can talk about sugar. We can talk about, you know, the history of foodstuffs and how transformational it was to incorporate these natural sweeteners and later artificial sweeteners into the culinary palette of the world, really, you know, coffee, tea. So again, so many of these are, you know, crops that were cultivated by, you know, African peoples.
And to change gears a little bit, when we met with Martina, she told us about, I unfortunately don't have the list of the titles of these pieces, but I'm curious, were you, Martina was talking about different relationships between some artifacts that were like encased and hanging on the wall as they related to some of the paintings in the exhibit. I'm curious, were there You know, given your specialty is these spiritual artifacts and healing and stuff, were there examples of those kind of artifacts in the show?
Artifacts that,
Like healing, spiritual items used in different rituals.
well, I would say that there were references to different um, objects, not necessarily healing artifacts per se. But I do think that the Gullah Geechee baskets are a good example of a very multidimensional and a very dynamic art form. Baskets are used all over the world for all types of things, right? They can be used for the most mundane goods of, holding foodstuffs when you go to the market. They can be used for the carrying of ceremonial implements of a king or queen, and so I think that there are certain references to traditions that had many layered meanings, historically speaking, even if they are reinterpreted as the Gullah Geechee baskets are today in a more secular context that are largely, largely aesthetic and largely used for simply decorative purposes.
Mm-hmm.
They're functional, but they have they're functional and they still have aesthetic qualities. I think that's something that's very true of a lot of regions of the world. That's true of a lot of objects and artifacts of Asia, for instance, and of the Americas. And wasn't necessarily true of a lot of art traditions of Europe. And I think that's one of the reasons why Europeans were so fascinated with collecting them. The idea that you would have like an Akan stool that, serves multiple roles, that you would have a, ceremonial staff that, yes, is meant to be used as an emblem of royalty, but also plays a role in a healing ceremony. That concept, I think, was not quite exactly the same. Art was something that was meant to be observed from afar, and that was meant to be purely aesthetic, as opposed to having a functional purpose as well.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if that has to do also with maybe more like puritanical value systems of not wanting to have the items that you have in your home or that you use daily be too, I don't know if gaudy is the right word, but too beautiful, I guess.
I think that's a great read. I love that interpretation, and I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's very appropriate in the context of New England especially, right, where you have all these horrible liquor laws, which means we can't have any delightful happy hour. Yeah. So there are these ways that these colonial values, and specifically the puritanical values that you're pointing to, really de-emphasized the role of the individual as being, well, let me take a step back. The puritanical values and legacies of Protestant religious tradition really shied away from the role of material culture as a direct conduit to the divine world. That's the reason that I think you see so many nations that were colonized by Catholic European countries continuing these vibrant African art traditions and these vibrant African religious traditions in places like Brazil, in places like Cuba, in places like Haiti. That's very different in places like Jamaica and Barbados and the Bahamas. Right. And you see that not only in the artistic traditions, but especially in the religious traditions. There's a different relationship to material culture. Why? Because in Catholicism, even in Europe, you had the saints. Right. And the saints were propitiated not as divine, like the way that God or Jesus was divine, but as divine entities upon, whom you could rely on, upon whom you could call on when you were in need. And so that lineage and that legacy, I think, of Catholic, emblems, icons, iconography was something that a lot of people of African descent could relate to, because they had long used objects as ways not, of embodying spirit necessarily, but of creating channels, of creating portals, of creating avenues of connection with the divine world.
There's a lot of artists, I feel like, that try to use like different religious imagery or compositions, specifically like, Catholic compositions in their painting to try to invoke this like sense of kind of spiritual depth and otherworldliness. Do you feel like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, is it, I'm losing, God damn it, I'm losing my question a little bit. I'm sorry. I guess I'm wondering too, like, do you feel like there's a lot of people or contemporary artists using like, or can you describe different ways that contemporary artists are doing a similar thing but with traditions in West Africa?
Oh, sure. So, I mean, if we look at, let's see. So we talked a little bit about VV, which are still used, I should mention, in Benin today. We can talk about textile traditions in West Africa. We can talk about ceramics. We haven't talked about ceramics, so let's maybe talk about ceramics. The use of ceramics is incredibly ancient. Of course, we find pots and vessels used all over the world. If we look, for instance, at Ghana, if we look, for instance, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you see clay pots that are fashioned either by men or by women, and that are used, again, in both a secular context and a sacred context. In the context of Congo, where I do research, you can see the use of what are known as banzungu ya bankoko, literally meaning the vessels of the ancestors that are used in healing ceremonies, and used in healing ceremonies as a way of propitiating the ancestors, and speaking directly to the ancestors as bearers of knowledge. So you would not only make offerings to the spirits by, for instance, putting palm wine as an offering in the vessel, but also using them as divination implements. So sometimes the color that the products would turn in a special vessel in the DR Congo would indicate different things about a patient's condition, different reasons that a particular illness may have befallen them, different reasons that a particular condition may be causing them strife or difficulty. And that is the same vessel that is used to hold, in another context, grain and cornmeal, to make cassava, to make fufu, which is made with cassava and cornmeal, right? And so the difference, what is the difference? Interestingly, not in the material. The difference, and I love this, is in the piece's activation. If you go to the marketplace and take home a pot and put it in the kitchen and use it for stored goods, that's the life that pot will live. But if, on the other hand, you take it to a priest, or a priest purchases it and they use it in the context of ceremony, by blessing it ceremonially, by offering, to the spirits this vessel as a method of divine communication, then that's what role it will play. Right? And that's something that you see in a lot of parts of West Africa. Tools that can be used in a ceremonial context are sometimes completely unique to that ceremony, and other times are no different than objects that you would find at the marketplace, but have been activated in such a fashion as to play a role of sacred quality.
That's very interesting, because I feel like I'm thinking about this in the context of thinking about maybe European art around the same time, like colonial America. And I feel like there's such an interesting difference in the way that religion and religious artifacts are regarded, where there's so much separation, I feel like, from this puritanical or like Catholic way of thinking about it, between what is like for daily use and what is for religious use. Like there's a certain reverence, and especially those really beautiful items or portraits wouldn't be as commonplace. And there's certain places and settings in which it is appropriate to, like a place where maybe God would be, And I feel like it's really interesting and beautiful to think about it from this other perspective, where it seems like maybe the sacred is more present, I guess.
I think that that's true. And I think that you see this in a lot of indigenous traditions of Africa and a lot of indigenous traditions of the Americas as well. It's not unique to one region on the continent. And it's also not unique to, I mean, even if you look at a lot of different Asian cultures, I know I was mentioning, the use of ceramics. I mean, you have remarkable ceramic traditions of China, of Japan that are used in tea ceremonies. Tea is an everyday part of life. It's, again, what Europeans were traveling all over the world to find. And it serves in these secular roles, and it also serves in these ceremonial roles. So I do think that that's true. And I think that that has much more to do with the fact that the sacred is not regarded as a separate entity or a separate, how shall I say, the sacred is not divorced from the profane world. Any space can be transformed into a sacred realm through activation of a space, through invocation of divine presences. And because of that, you demonstrate gratitude and appreciation for every step you take, and you ask permission for the trees. I mean, we haven't even touched on musical instruments, but music and dance was a theme that was also present. We had some pieces that were looking at representations of Josephine Baker, who was such a radical of her time period, who was so committed to social justice campaigns. Though she was a dancer in World War II, she really saw herself as choosing a different path, in part because she thought that the United States was just terribly racist. And so she decided to relocate to France. So how do we think about, not only writers such as Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright relocating to places in Europe, people like Josephine Baker, but also people who relocated to Ghana. W.E. Du Bois lived his last decades actually in Ghana. He decided that's where he wanted to live and live out the rest of his days, So I think there's a really interesting way in which you see a reverence for a different approach to these artistic traditions that create a different sort of story about people's experiences of identity and culture. I think I ended up connecting her story a little bit more to, other radical political actors of, the 1960s in a new light, because of the emphasis not only on dance, but because of the emphasis on the civil rights and the, Black radical tradition that the show was interested in emphasizing.
One thing I feel like, I guess, to try to put it as a question, it seems like a lot, or something I'm noticing a lot, is that in terms of West African religious acts and objects, it seems like so much of it focuses on the process of creating something or using an object that you made, and I feel like so much other religions are focusing on things that have already been made. Does that make sense? Like, you wouldn't, or like a lot of, like at a church or Catholic church, you don't go there and make the wine. And like, I feel like I almost wonder if that process focused tradition, and like, I wonder if that, I guess, of deepening, connection to culture and stuff, because when like you're in like a sacred space that you made or that you created or facilitated in some way, I mean, it seems like it'd be more powerful than one that, I don't know, that you happened upon, or that was built in like 1899 or something out of brick.
I think that's a really interesting interpretation, and I would say that, again, not to suggest that African and African diaspora traditions are completely unique in this fashion. I would say that that's something that you can see also in, South Asian traditions, something that you can see also in traditions of the Americas. And it doesn't, I want to I want to point out that it doesn't mean every single time that somebody is the creator of an object, but they would be a part of the process of activation in the context of ceremony, and I do make that distinction because I think it's important to note that, it's not as if everybody on the African continent is, making the goods that they are using,
Right,
or that they are employing in the context of ceremony. But with that said, I agree that the process of creation is at times just as powerful as is the implementation of these sacred objects. And that's really stirring. That's really, I think, exciting. It's humbling. And it does allow one to feel a certain degree of connection to the experience, especially because there's a lot of emphasis on individuality. I think that's another thing that you see more of in the context of African and African diaspora art traditions. If somebody comes to you with a particular illness, they would have a particular ritual conducted for them, and a particular, healing rite conducted for them that's unique to them. A divination would take place, a divination does take place still today, that is, specifically designed to invoke and welcome in their ancestors, so that remedy, that treatment can be unique to that person. And I think that level of intentionality is really quite striking. And it's it indicates a very particular degree of intimacy with the divine world, that the divine has time for each individual prayer and will respond accordingly based on your specific needs. And, I think that that's something that Protestantism was actually trying to achieve, not necessarily intentionally, but the idea that, Catholic priests were the only one could communicate with God was something that I think a lot of Protestants, and particularly Anglicans, were rebelling against. No, there are ways that we should be able to connect with our God through prayer and through rites of, our own connections. And so that's something that I think, is a desire of humankind. To be able to have direct access to the divine is very special. It's very special and empowering. That's really the word, empowering.
I think I'm making this connection late, but we're mostly talking could you talk more about the idea of activation? Because I noticed I said, making the connection late about talking about a pot might be used to be storing goods and food, but it also might be used in a spiritual context. But I guess I'm wondering if you could describe that concept and where it comes from.
Sure. Well, not maybe where it comes from, because that's something that I think is
probably infinite,
unique to every cultural.
Right.
It's unique to every cultural context. But I think it's an excellent question, and it's something that you see in a lot of different traditions around the world. So I'll give you an example of a ritual rattle in Haiti. I've spoken a little bit about mystic pots, but in the context of Haiti and Haitian culture, for instance, you have what are known as assons, which are the mark of the priesthood. This is a ritual rattle that is used as a symbol that marks one's status as a high priest or a high priestess. And they are made with calabash gourds that have been hollowed out, and beads. And today the beads can be plastic or they can be glass. Once upon a time they might have been more likely to be snake vertebrae, that make a sort of rich clack sound against the gourd itself. So this net of beads or this net of bones is strung in intricate fashion around the outside of the calabash gourd, and makes this really beautiful sound. And in the process of activation, there are certain things that are only revealed to initiates, but what we can say, and what I think is really helpful, what I can say and what I think is really helpful for us to understand is that the process of activation is one that takes place with offerings to the spirits in the context of the collective, but again is unique to each individual. So an activation process may look like the piece, the work, the ritual rattle in this case, being sanctified with offerings to the spirits in the form of sacred liquors, in the form of animal offerings. but continually throughout the context of ceremony, the piece can be reactivated. So when saluting a particular spirit for whom the rattle is considered sacred, you would spray the ritual gourd rattle with divine liquor and divine substance as a way of sort of refreshing it, reawakening its senses. And that's something that you see pretty frequently. You know, the idea that these objects are not simply inanimate, but they have a life force of their own. Not necessarily that they are spirits, not necessarily that they are gods. That's a very clear distinction that people will make. But that they have a divine quality means that they need to be propitiated, means that they need to be reactivated and reanimated in the same way that we need food, in the same way that we need sustenance. And it is the work of a priest or a priestess or a healer who can perform that work so that the object can be reanimated and maintain its efficacy, because that's something that you see time and time again. The idea that these sacred objects are not simply, objects to be sitting on an altar inanimately or passively, but that they are brought from an altar table into the context of ceremony to perform a role, to perform a function, to anoint a king or queen, to bejewel an initiate on their way to the forest, to be used in somebody's healing experience. They have a purpose, they have a role, and eventually they may break and need to be replaced, or they may need to be refreshed, but they need to be cared for like, divine beings.
Could you describe, I'm sure this might be different, or is probably different through all types of different cultures, but could you describe the difference between ancestors and spirits and gods? Because it's
Sure.
go ahead, please. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, like, I don't know if like gods and spirits are the correct words, or if those would be interchangeable.
So they are often used interchangeably.
Okay.
I don't use the term gods when talking about African spirits,
Okay.
because a lot of people will tell you there is only one God.
Oh, okay.
Many, 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 if not most, West African and Central African religious traditions, and I would go on to say many, if not most, African diaspora religious traditions that are derived from these African religions, say there is one God, there is one creator, there is one supreme being. And then there are these intermediary entities. The intermediary entities are the spirits. They have different names in different regions. In the context of Yoruba lands, Nigeria, they are referred to as Orisha. Orisha is a term that is still used today in Brazil and in Cuba to refer to these spirits. And in the context of Haiti, they're known as Lua. In the context of Congo, these divine intermediaries are known as Basimbi or Bisimbi, right? And so I think that this is where the use of indigenous languages is really helpful for us and illuminating, because there are times when, we mistakenly translate something because we think we understand it, not realizing that some of those mistranslations can really be quite harmful, because it gives people a different understanding. When I talk about ancestors, it's a little bit more complicated, because they are at once ancestors and spirits. Let me explain. Spirits is a larger umbrella category. Okay. Ancestors, and typically spirits do not have to be biologically related to anybody. You can have a spirit of the river, a spirit of the mountain, a spirit of, so natural phenomena. You can also have spirits of principles of thought or elements and domains of life, like love or war or illness. Right? So those are spirits. That's the larger category. Ancestors are those whom we have relation to. But if you go back in your lineage, probably you can name, I certainly hope you can name your grandparents.
Right.
If you keep going, hopefully you have heard of great-grandparents, but maybe you don't know their names. Or maybe you can have your memory jogged. But if you were to go back 5 or 6 generations, it'd be very difficult to find somebody who knows the names of their ancestors.
Right.
Right? And so there's a transitional period in which these ancestors, whom we know are related to us, really become more like principles or ideas. And that's a concept that I think is really beautifully identified in a lot of African religions by prayers that invoke the ancestors whose names we know and those names whom we have forgotten. That's something that you'll hear very commonly in prayers when people are invoking the ancestors. You know, the ancestors that are closest to you, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, in some ways they have the most powerful reach because they knew you. And you can turn to them for guidance because they'll want to help you. But even your ancient ancestors, who maybe going back many generations, you share with an entire community. I mean, once upon a time, before people moved all over the world, right? Once upon a time, those ancestors were extremely powerful because they were shared by so many people. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So ancestors can be a type of spirit, but they have connection to us through lineage. That's the difference. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in terms of the spirits, they're not always anthropomorphic. Like they can be kind of conceptual or relating to something natural. And the ancestors can kind of blend into both categories.
Yes, I would say that's a good way to put it.
I had a question too. This might not be related, but when you said the ancestors whose names we've forgotten, I know that there is one wall plaque in the exhibit specifically that, if it were in another context, might say artist unknown, but it says instead artists. What did it say specifically? Artists whose names were once known but are now forgotten.
Yes.
Is that a nod to that?
It in some ways is. It's a very late. I'm so glad you mentioned that. I think that was such a brilliant incorporation. You know, there is a tradition of museums really doing a lot of colonial violence in the history of collecting, and also in the practice of defacing works of sacred and secular quality in African contexts. And a lot of times objects were looted, you know, stolen, they were acquired, sometimes through trade, but sometimes through outright theft. You know, so you have, for instance, the Benin bronzes. In 1896 or 1897, you had the Benin kingdom was raided by Europeans off of a false pretense that they had previously experienced a raid from the Benin kingdom. It was in fact a ploy, and 2,000 objects were stolen from the king's palace. And there's these really great, you know, comedians take on this. It's like remarkable that these colonial histories of art theft are still placed on display unabashedly, unashamedly. You know, there's not, you know, it's not being hidden. 900 of these Benin bronzes are actually on public display right now at the British Museum. Okay, and so the question that you pose about a difference in framing is really important, because a lot of times when these objects were stolen, no names were taken, because art was not regarded as something that Africans were sophisticated enough intellectually to understand, which is so preposterous. It is so absurd, and it is really offensive, because it suggests, once again, that there's only one way of understanding what art is, and then there's only one way of defining what art is. In the context of the Western world, art historically has been objects that have no utilitarian function. That's not true in many other parts of the world, including a lot of parts of East Asia, South Asia, and really a lot of the indigenous Americas. Art was something that could be functional, and it simply had aesthetic qualities that enhanced its functional abilities. And so when you have these histories of going into a museum and seeing objects made by Black people with no name, no date. I mean, you know, if you go into any African art gallery, you'd be amazed at how little information there seems to be available, right? It's like maybe between the 16th and 18th centuries, possibly this region, possibly this ethnic group or that ethnic group, no name for an artist.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas when you study European art and when you look at the specificity of detail listed, I mean, it's, you know, we know like what block Leonardo da Vinci was on when he painted this work.
Yeah.
Right. We know the name of the mine where the marble was drawn, right?
Exactly. We know the names of all the 155 artisans who were involved in the creation of the Sistine Chapel.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think
Wow.
that inclusion is a nod to the fact that to say artist unknown suggests that nobody knew the name of the artist.
Yeah.
That's not true. We don't know the name of the artist, perhaps because of our colonial legacies of collecting, perhaps because that name was deemed unimportant or uninteresting to the collector, or perhaps because it wasn't important for the artist to sign their name because the work was sacred and religious, and it wouldn't have been appropriate to take credit for something that is of a divine quality. Right. And so I love that members of the curatorial team were thinking more creatively about how can we acknowledge that there isn't a singular name whom we can cite here, but we can recognize that once this name was known, we simply don't have it available right now.
That's so powerful, too, for that to be in an exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts, because it's not like something that is beautiful about the museum is that it's a long-standing institution and there's so much heritage there, but what that comes with is that institution is not innocent in any of this and have long contributed to it, actually.
Absolutely. And the MFA is unique in that it has a curator of provenance. That's something that I didn't realize was so rare, So the curator of provenance, their work is to, as much as possible, identify whether the objects that are on display and the objects that are in the museum's collection were legally acquired. And in fact, there was a case a couple of years ago, you can find this on YouTube, there was a case a couple of years ago of the curator of provenance determined that there were several objects from the Benin Kingdom, which was in current-day Nigeria, that had been stolen, that had been looted, and there was a very fishy paper trail. I love it when curators use terms like fishy. It was a very fishy paper trail, meaning that it was like an attempt to suggest that all of these objects were legally acquired, but it was a falsehood. And so they actually did some work to try to return these objects. And I think that's, an extremely controversial topic right now, but a really important one. And now I don't teach African art history classes anymore without covering that topic, because I think it's so illuminating about our history and what is the role of museums in education, but also in activism and, artists' rights. And students are really interested in it. They're really curious to know, oh, wow, well, we've never thought about the fact that 95% of African art that is currently on display in the world is exhibited outside of the continent of Africa.
95%. Wow.
95%. That would be unthinkable for Asian art. That would be unthinkable for European art. And so what is the role and what is the responsibility of these museum institutions in restitution and repatriation, rematriation of these art forms? What is their role? What is their responsibility? What is our role and our responsibility? And if the argument is, well, we don't think that European, museums can be matched, and Africa doesn't have enough museums to be able to store these objects in a safe fashion and protect them in a safe fashion, then why don't you take some of the money that you've acquired over these past 100 years with people coming all over the world to see the British Museum's collections to build museums? How about that? You know what I mean?
Right.
How about creating more egalitarian partnerships? I mean, I had one student, I loved that this was their suggestion. It was so clever to me. They said, well, Dr. D, why don't they just, return the objects to the sacred communities that had created them and then 3D print new ones?
Oh,
and I thought, that is such a Gen Z answer. It's so brilliant. It's so brilliant, right? And what a cool placard. Imagine walking into a museum, seeing an object that looks like the real deal, and reading a plaque that says, actually, this is a replica. The real sacred staff, the real sacred, pots, the real ritual rattle has been returned to, Benin Kingdom, Nigeria, has been returned to Yaka nations of the Democratic Republic of Congo. What a cool story, and what an intriguing and interactive sort of set of dialogues can emerge. And I don't want to suggest that this is something that has an easy solution. I'm very cognizant of the fact that, again, the colonial history of violence means that there are a lot of objects that really, it would be quite difficult to determine where their locus of origin is. I'm fully aware of that. But bring Africans into the conversation. Bring Black people into the conversation about what should be done with these objects and with these artifacts, so that it can be a more fruitful and productive conversation moving forward.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about, I've actually never heard of the title before, or Curator of Provenance? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've never heard of that before. It sounds like an extremely interesting job.
It sounds like such a cool job, right? I think it's something that more museums should have. I mean, of course, the MFA team would know more about the specific work that this person does. But what I can say is, provenance means determining its origin. And so in this context, you're looking at, different objects that are in the museum's collection, different objects that are being placed on display, and saying, what does the paper trail look like? Where can we sort of trace this object? We're hoping that, it looks like something like this. An object was donated to the museum by a collector who bought the mask, for instance, from Burkina Faso at an auction in England. And the mask came to the auction in England because somebody traveled to Burkina Faso, 50 years ago and made this purchase of a mask from the artisan who created it themselves, or an art dealer. And the art dealer had gotten it from a local artisan who had made the mask themselves. That's what you would hope for.
Right.
But along the way, there's a lot of fudging of history that can take place, and there's a lot of misinformation, so you can have forged papers, for instance. You can have forged papers of acquisition from an art dealer or an art trader. A lot of the complications that you have that are quite, I think, profound, is that you will often see the artisans and the artists being Black, being, Senegalese or Congolese or Cameroonian, and the art dealers may be African, but the art dealers are a lot of times European or white American, right? And so there's a already emerging a different power dynamic. Language may be an issue, right? So if somebody says that they engaged with so-and-so, and paid this price for the object, but in fact it was determined that, it was like $15, and then they turned around and sold it to Sotheby's for $15 million. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but terribly, then you start to have ethical questions emerge about, did the trader know the real value of this object and cheat the artisan who created the object? So all of these types of questions can emerge for curators of provenance as, questions to be considered, matters to be discussed, and questions to be investigated, because, hopefully you have an opportunity to allow an art object to tell its own story, but how much more powerful that story is when the object was fairly acquired, safely brought to a museum, and that the artist was well paid, well compensated for their work. That's the ideal, that's the ideal scenario. And that's unfortunately not the case with a lot of African art. I will not say all, I will not say most, but a lot of African art has not been acquired in a safe and legal, fashion, and an ethical fashion.
Is the concept of tracing provenance in that way a newer thing, or is that something that museums have recently started doing?
I think that it was always done, but maybe had a different name. And my guess is, museums have changed so much in, their inception. Art museums have different histories than ethnographic museums, because that's the other thing, is that a lot of African artwork is actually still housed in ethnographic museums that were created as sort of, houses that kept objects of curiosity, these strange, peculiar fetish objects. That's a term that tragically is still being used to describe a lot of African sacred artworks that I think we should just banish altogether.
Yeah.
I mean, the concept of fetish is, something that has or brings inappropriate value to an object, but who's to determine what is an inappropriate value, right? That's something that's usually determined by outsiders. If you call something a fetish, it's because you determine that it should not be a value. And so people didn't understand why, again, a ceramic pot that they might see in the context of a cooking, or a kitchen space, they would not understand why somebody might, regard it in such a profound ceremonial fashion if they don't understand that cosmologically you can activate a pot and have it transform into something other than just a cooking vessel. Okay, so fetish is a term that is used, I think, wildly inappropriately to talk about a lot of African art. I think that it has been of great importance in art museums to have a traceable lineage of how a artwork was acquired. And this is also important because, especially with living artists, it's much easier to trace, how an object has made its way. And it's much easier to trace if somebody has been cheated. This is something that I think is really regarded of great importance when you're looking at works by famous artists like Picasso or Leonardo da Vinci, right? Because people want to use the paper trail to ensure that it is in fact an original, to ensure that the artist is who the artist really says it is on the canvas or on the sculpture itself. And so I don't think the concept of tracing an art form's or, an art object's history and its arrival to a museum is a unique phenomenon or a new phenomenon, but I do think that the idea and the recognition of colonial violence and the acquisition of a lot of goods created, fashioned by people of color, particularly with African art, particularly with, art of the Americas. I mean, when we talk about First Nations art, oh my goodness, there's so much that's been looted. There are so many unjust stories of Native American remains being held by museums because of grave robbers going to cemeteries in First Nations communities and digging up bones. I mean, talk about morbid, like we wonder where these creepy stories of vampires emerged. They come from European colonial history. Things
doing
that
creepy
people
stuff.
Did. Yeah, creepy illegal stuff, right? And so that's a huge issue right now that's being discussed by First Nations elders and council community members as to how can we try to restore a semblance of justice to these ancestors, going back to this term, whose, sleep, whose slumber, whose, state of rest has been so greatly disturbed by this colonial act of violence. So it's not a new phenomenon. Think that there is hopefully growing attention on the fact that these are questions we need to be asking more regularly, and these are questions that we need to be dealing with more in terms of thinking about what the solution will be. And the solution should not just be, let's avoid things altogether and pretend like it's okay to keep, exhibiting all these works with no sort of added context and no set of discussions about, whether these objects should be returned, replaced, what have you.
So maybe the sort of more ethical perspective on it is a little bit newer, but maybe protecting an investment is a role that Providence has played before.
Oh, yes. I think that's very well said, that it's about protecting the investment. Yes. And what I would say is not quite that the ethical questions are new, but the ethical questions with an emphasis on colonial violence and its role in the acquisition of objects from places like the African continent or First Nations communities in the Americas. And I wish that there were many more. Like I said, the MFA is unique in having a curator of Providence. That's not typical. That's new. And so I hope that that's something that we start to see more of. But for now, that's still something that we're seeing certain museums being courageous about. And there's still more that can be done.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I didn't realize that the MFA was unique in that way.
It's really almost disturbing, too, to think about, even calling back to the conversation earlier about activation and talking about how these objects have been
Oh, yes.
like transubstantiated into capital, like from sacred objects into assets.
And desanctified.
Yeah.
You know, absolutely. There's a lot of questions about if you have a particular mask that represents or embodies spirit that has been on display. What do you do to free and liberate this imprisoned divine entity that is caged in a glass case? I mean, so, you know, something that I really love to share with my students is the scene from Black Panther where Killmonger asks the curator, right, about the history of these objects, and she's answering them with proficiency and adroitness, and he gets to one object, the last object, and she says, such and such, such and such, such and such, and he says no. Says it's actually made of vibranium, and it's from Wakanda, and it's probably from the such and such century. And I think that there is, you know, a ripple of laughter that goes through the room when I share that with my students, but it's followed by a more thoughtful conversation, because he says, do you think that your ancestors had a right to take these objects from my people? Right. And I do think that we have to be more willing to have these difficult conversations about, you know, who has a right to display these objects, to display these artifacts. What is their role, you know, in museums? Usually museums will answer it's an educational purpose. If it's just an educational purpose, you know, why aren't we thinking more creatively about how to represent the way that these objects lived ceremonial lives? You know, these masks were not meant to sit in inanimate fashion on the ground or on a pedestal or a podium. They were meant to be danced. So show a YouTube clip, show on an iPad. You know, these museums have so much money and so many resources. Having a few iPads in an African art gallery would not be out of the budget to demonstrate how these masquerades really embodied profound qualities of performance and aesthetic animation that brings these entities to life, right? And so if the purpose of is education, well, we're not doing a very good job of really educating the population about how these objects were used. And if the purpose is education, don't communities on the continent deserve to be educated about their own history and cultural legacies?
Yeah, an interesting thing too is when, building off of your point, when you're walking through a gallery like that where all of the work, it says unknown, or it just has like a small description of the piece and says wood or something like that, and there's no sort of cultural context at all. Something that we've really been enjoying about doing this project for the podcast and talking to all of you about this show is the information that we're getting, because we had an opportunity to speak at length with Ife Franklin about indigo dyeing and adiri cloth.
Wonderful.
And we had a really lovely conversation with Stephen Hamilton about just different figures that are occurring in just different mythologies and these kinds of things that I feel like we're almost oversaturated all the time with information about Greek myth or Catholicism or these same like few cultures, and you walk through a gallery like that with so much richness, and you don't have the context to even understand what you're looking at, even when it is there.
That's right. I agree 100%. And I think that those types of contextual histories are really empowering for everybody, and especially for people of African descent, who have been told, you know, for hundreds of years, Africa is a country, not a continent. Africa has one culture. Africa has a culture that is barbaric, that is uncivilized, that is backwards. You know, to be introduced to different cultural traditions that are specific, that are geographically unique, you know, that are tied to traditions that are now still alive and well in the United States, that's empowering, that's exciting, that's enlivening, and it does really important, again, liberation work. It's not simply about, you know, seeing some pretty art on a wall. When you can say, like, wow, I have a Dominican grandparent, and yes, I should be proud to claim them as members of the African diaspora, as well as a Haitian grandmother. That's really important work that we can do to emphasize the variety of experiences of Blackness in the Americas, of Blackness in the Atlantic world, and to recognize that these are not traditions that are dead or only dying. I think that's another thing that's really important. And I know that this is something that Stephen and I talk about frequently. It's really upsetting that there are so many ways that African art is spoken about using only the past tense, as if all of these traditions have died out and have no future and have no, real sort of imagined way forward. And the reality is that you have lots of contemporary artists who are continuing traditional, artistic traditions and also innovating upon them in really exciting ways. Ella Natsri is an amazing and incredibly talented artist who does work with bottle caps, recycled bottle caps, and creates these stunning visual tapestries, of metal. And it's a commentary on environmentalism. It's a commentary on, capitalist waste and overproduction. And it's also drawing from beautiful textile traditions of Ghana and of Nigeria and of Senegal, right? And so you see that there are really exciting ways that contemporary artists are continuing to draw from these traditions in new fashions. And that's something that I think Touching Roots was really interested in remarking upon and creating connections for audience members. These are not traditions that exist in isolation from one another. And how much more enlightened we can be if we can see the ways that a Brazilian artist includes, for instance, an axe of Shango, who is a spirit of thunder and lightning from Nigeria, What does it look like when he reimagines the presence of Shango in a Brazilian context? That's a reclaiming of his Blackness. That's a proud reclaiming of his Africanness. And whether he understands all of the cultural context of it or not, that's his reinterpretation of an ancient tradition that he still sees as vital and an important part of his present experience as a Black man in Brazil today.
I have to say, this has been wildly educational. This has been such a fun conversation. So we have not we've obviously had zero expectations, and we have not had any idea what to anticipate from any of these interviews, and each one has been so fun, and it's been such a pleasure talking to you. So I really appreciate you making the time to come on here with your work schedule and your family life and stuff. So
absolutely, you're very welcome. I'm glad the timing worked out. Little one was patient with us.
And congratulations also. It's so exciting. Baby on the way.
Thank you. We're very excited. First grandchild on both sides.
Oh.
Everyone's excited. Everyone's thrilled.
That's so special.
Yeah, what a beautiful time.
Thank you.
So yeah, I just want to say, we absolutely loved the show, and it's also and doing this project, interviewing everybody has been so fun. So once again, I can't say it enough. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yes, thank you.
It's been amazing.
You're very welcome. I'm so looking forward to hearing the podcast episode.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Well, we'll keep you appraised of the details as the production comes along, and we look forward to maybe seeing you in the future and talking again.
Sounds great. Have a wonderful evening, y'all. Have a great start to the fall season, and looking forward to hearing updates to come.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Have a wonderful night.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That was
a good one.
That was wonderful. I like doing a little secret, that was awesome after we hang out.
Are you gonna include those in the final cut?
I don't know what's gonna go in the final cut, honestly. Me turning off the recorder and being like, "Fuck, I'm so dumb." Okay.
That was Kyrah Malika Daniels, professor at Emory University and a curator on Touching Roots, Black Ancestral Legacies in the Americas. Kyrah is currently completing a book titled Art of the Healing Gods, Illness, Imbalance, and Sacred Arts of the Black Atlantic, described in her bio as a comparative religion project that examines ritual art traditions and religious healing legacies of Kongo-derived communities in Haiti and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The book investigates how sacred art objects mediate relationships between humans and spirits and healing ceremonies to treat spiritual illness and imbalance holistically. Kyrah's work has also been published in the Journal of Africana Religions, Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, the Journal of Haitian Studies, and the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. To find out more about Kyrah or anyone else you've interviewed from this series, check out the blog on our website, bostonartpodcast.com, where we post links, pictures, and sources to things we mentioned during the episode. Boston Art Podcast is an independent DIY production by Brian Huntress and Theodora Earthworms. The information contained in this episode represents the views and opinions of the original creators or our guests, and does not represent any institution, organization, or business. Find us on Instagram at Boston Art Podcast, and tune in for a new episode every Friday. Thank you for listening.